So that's why by the time when you go to the moon, that's 240,000 miles away. So you're way out in free space at that point, no drag at all. Early on, we had two categories of spaceflight. There was unmanned spaceflight and manned spaceflight. And obviously it was true for the times because everybody that went into space was a man. Those terms became unusable for a lot of reasons. One, politically, but more so a lot of women have now been into space. So we struck those titles and made it robotic spaceflight and human spaceflight. And that really describes what we do today in space. And by the way, I know there's some questions already about working for NASA. ESA, the European Space Agency, is the counterpart to NASA, very much in partnership on almost everything we've ever done, except Apollo. But they were building ESA up at that point. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about robotics. This is going to be fast. You use it every day, a lot of commercial communications, television, so forth, weather and climate satellites that you see on your TV, and also read about what they can do now in determining what's going on. Earth resources is the measuring of the resources on Earth, like progress sciences. We've seen probes that go into Mars, Jupiter, Pluto, even a lot of planetary, and they are precursors. In my way of thinking, they are the precursors to human space flight. And then in Earth orbit, we just do a lot of scientific research, a lot of things weightless. I'll give you an example. One is pharmaceuticals, which they have found that in zero G, you can separate basic stuff with in a way you can't do it on Earth. So there's a lot of research just trying to be in space. And then there's a big elephant in the room that the Department of Defense, and this is true both in our country and in America and also in the UK. Many satellites that gather intelligence, most of it is obviously very secret. You don't hear much about it. It's very encrypted data, and all the countries around the world do it. Defense communications are entirely different than the commercial communications. You can't get on them. They're used in the battlefield. They're used in other places. Navigation, the GPS that drives your cell phone location, was actually put into orbit and still is maintained by the military. It's a constellation of satellites. And then, for instance, when in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, we fly drones, but we fly those from the United States. And so we don't have pilots in them, and they do a lot of intelligence gathering, but they could also deliver weapons. And one thing, final thing, and this is the last we're going to talk about robotic space, the Department of Defense budget in the US by far overshadows everything else we do. It's called the black budget. You never hear about it. You don't know how big it is, but it's huge and a very big operation. And so I bring this up because all of these things are a piece of robotic technology, and it's getting better and better, and it's going more toward AI, artificial intelligence. And so it's something that there's all kinds of fields for people to go to work in this remote robotic area. So I just wanted you to know that. So our primary focus today is on human spaceflight. And I'm going to give you a quick history and pictures. Let's look at what happened from 1945, the end of World War II, where we had some fighters. I should have put a Spitfire there instead of a P-51, but we'll let it go. And we had the V-2 rocket that rained some terror on London. In a relatively short time later, we started Program Mercury, which was a one-man capsule right at the very top of this Atlas rocket. In this is an Atlas that launched John Glenn into orbit. And then in 1968, just 6 years after we started with Mercury, we created Apollo and got it to the moon. First time in 1968. So it was quite an advancement, and it happened fairly fast. There were 3 guys that really kind of made it happen. These were all rocket guys, a Russian, an American, and a German. Notice that their birthdays overlapped, and these 3 guys actually talked. Well, they corresponded with each other, and on rocketry, and they kept saying, "Yeah, you might do this, we might could do that, we might could do this," back and forth. And so they developed, and Robert Goddard over here in this country actually launched the first American liquid rocket. It wasn't much bigger than a tube of paste, but it worked, And so anyway, these 3 guys were really the fathers of rocketry as we know it. And I started clear back with the Chinese, but these guys perfected it. The Germans picked up on it first, and in World War II, in this base way up here, way north in Germany, called Peenemünde, is where they developed 2 vehicles that anybody with a London background knows a lot about, their families anyway. First was the V1. V was Vengeance. Vengeance 1, the buzz bomb. And they launched those from mobile launchers off the French in the area of Calais and rained them down with great terror on London. A lot of destruction, a lot of death. But it wasn't even a rocket, it was a pulse jet. That thing on the tail, sitting on top, is a pulse jet engine. Actually burned gasoline, just like you do in your car. And it was pulsed a jet, and that's why it made the buzzing sound. But they did build the V2, Vengeance 2, and it was a 2-stage liquid-propelled rocket. And had they gotten this developed earlier, the World War II may have had a different outcome, because it came in right at the end of the war. And again, the V2 biggest impact was in London, did a lot of damage. And that was, the Peenemünde operation was run by a guy named Werner von Braun. Von Braun, at the time this picture was taken at Peenemünde, was 29 years old. He was kind of a genius at rocketry. And when the war ended, the Russians tried to get most of the guys, and we tried to get most of the guys. And it turns out we ended up with von Braun, and we were very, very fortunate, because he's the one that got us the Saturn rocket that got us onto the moon. You'll see the American GI in the far left of the picture with his helmet on. This was the day that he had actually gotten himself turned in to the Americans. And he had been in a car wreck and he broke his arm. I got to know von Braun, and a very interesting guy. Well, the Russians picked up, though, and they took their technology even faster than we did, and they launched the Soviet Sputnik. This was about a 23-inch round satellite, weighed about 200 pounds. All it did was go in Earth orbit and beep, 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 but it threw the terror in the rest of, particularly the Western world, that the Russians had gotten ahead, the Soviets, in this case, it was the Soviet Union, and we were aghast. We answered in America with the Jupiter in '58. If I go back, this was October of '57, and so just a few minutes later, or a few months later, we launched the Jupiter, or the Explorer on the Jupiter, and as a Jupiter rocket. This was a payload up in the front end that was scientific and it actually discovered the Van Allen radiation belt. And so it was a good deal. But April of 61, the Russians, or the Soviet Union, I should say, beat us again. Yuri Gagarin, astronaut, went into orbit, launched on a Vostok K, which looks very much like the Soyuz rocket of today. It hasn't changed much. And at that point, something happened. This was only a month later. We had not even put anyone into orbit yet. That JFK, John F. Kennedy, our president, set the goal to go to the moon in this decade of the 60s, and landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And there was the goal. It was 240,000 miles away, 3,500 kilometers in diameter, so about a third the size of the Earth. And that was our goal, and it was clearly set. Let's go do it. Things happened in a hurry after that. The Mercury project came along. That was one person. Gemini was the second project. That was two people. And that's a very important program before we got to Apollo. Now, I want to make a point here. We call these different projects themselves, Mercury and Gemini. They were really all part of Apollo, because this is how we learned to get into space. Gemini taught us how to rendezvous and dock and things like that. And then Apollo was the culmination. Here was the sequence it went in. And notice I'm calling this Mercury Redstone on the left. There were only two missions flown of that. If you look at the very top, there is a capsule or a spacecraft carried one person. Two of these missions at the first, we flew on a Redstone missile, which was an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, that had already been on the shelf, already designed. We modified it to put people in orbit. We only flew two of those, and it was not enough to get into orbit. We could get into space. So we just lobbed them down the Pacific Ocean about 300 miles, and they got a few minutes of zero G, but that was all. Mercury Atlas came along, and the Atlas was a much bigger vehicle. It was another intercontinental ballistic missile that was modified to put this same capsule, same spacecraft that we had in Mercury on top, but it could go all the way to orbit. And we flew that 4 times. John Glenn was the first American to go into orbit, and we flew it 3 more times. Longest mission was only 34 hours, not nearly long enough to get to the moon. Then we launched the Gemini spacecraft with 2 people that we launched on another intercontinental ballistic missile, the Titan, that was modified to carry humans. And by the way, those modifications of these early vehicles, it was to give them more redundancy, to be more safe. We flew 10 missions of those, and that's really where we learned how to rendezvous and dock, go outside, do an extravehicular activity, EVA we call it, spacewalk, some people, and do work outside. And Gemini is the one that taught us how to do that. And then there was Apollo. The Apollo Saturn, the Saturn V, was von Braun's game. And these are not drawn to scale. These are not drawn to scale. They look kind of like they're the same size. This one's 111 meters long. The Saturn is huge compared to 25 meters on the Redstone. Giant vehicle. For those of you that are familiar with American football, it's longer than a football field, 100 yards. It's 363 feet. So von Braun was the one that gave us the liquid. This is the first time that we used this big rocket. I'm going to show you how we did that in this kind of a sequence. We got off to a really bad start. On Apollo 1, we had 3 guys, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, that were doing a pad test. We were on the pad at Cape Canaveral. and we had a fire on the pad inside the cockpit, and it killed all three of them. They were good friends, well known to us in mission control, and it was a very dark day. We learned a lot from that accident, but we paid a terrible, terrible price for it. And I'll discuss some of those as we go forward, some of those corrections that we did. Interestingly enough, only 21 months later, with a completely redesigned command module, which is that on the right-hand picture is that little white cone right at the top, completely redesigned, all the flammable material in it removed, the hatch in the old one swung in, which made it hard to get out of it in a hurry. The one on the new one actually had an explosive bolt that would blow it open and open it quickly. And we changed from 100% oxygen, which we had done in Mercury and Gemini, and we went to more like an air mixture. So it wasn't quite so flammable. These guys flew a great mission. And notice this date, October 1968. And then I think in the boldest decision ever made by the space agency, in December, 2 months later, we put 3 astronauts, Borman, Anders, and Lovell, on top of a Saturn V, which we had flown it in some unmanned versions, but never with people. We not only put them in it, we sent them to the moon. We didn't have a lander, so we went into orbit around the moon with Apollo 8 at Christmas of 1968. For all intents and purposes, and we didn't know it at the time, the space race with the Soviets was over about that time, because at the same time, they had a great big explosion on their launch pad where they were building their big Saturn class rocket. And it not only wiped out the pad and the rocket, they had their control people very close, and it damaged that building and killed some of their key people on the ground. So Apollo 8 was a milestone, big one. And after that, we rode that Saturn hard. I've already spoken of these 3 missions: Apollo 1, the fire, Apollo 7, Apollo 8, 7 in Earth orbit, 8 in lunar orbit, and then 9 is the first time we flew a lunar module, a lander, and we flew them in Earth orbit together. And they danced together, they docked, they undocked, etc. And then on Apollo 10, which was a dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11, the next flight, the first landing. This flight was not intended to land. It was taken into lunar orbit. It was docked up again. We did docking, started a landing and aborted it. That spacecraft, by the way, the lunar module could not have landed anyway. It was too heavy. There was a second block of spacecraft that came along, and that first one came on Apollo 11. Most of you have read a lot about and studied and so forth. Apollo 11, great day. A little more about that in a minute. 12 followed right on its heels. And it was a very successful mission. 13 didn't work so well. We had an oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, and it became a survival mission, which worked out well, as it turned out. Little on that later. 14, we did land. And then 15, 16, and 17, the last 3 missions, we call those the J missions. That was just a block of missions. This was the first time on Apollo 15 that we had a rover. So 15, 16, and 17 had the rover that actually went around the moon. And it gave us great more capability. These spacecraft, the lunar modules were designed such they could stay on the moon a little longer. So the stay time was longer. A lot of fun in those missions. I was on all of them. I was a flight director in mission control. A little more on that in a second. Landing sites. Here we go on the moon. Apollo 11 landed in the Sea of Tranquility, and those dark gray areas you see are more oceans and seas, thought to be at one time with water or some liquid on them, that over time flattened them and made them smoother. And then the cratered areas, the more cratered areas, they've got craters in the seas, but the big craters are in the highlands that are up higher, that you see in the light gray there. So we landed in the Sea of Tranquility. In that case, we said, told Neil Armstrong, just land anywhere where it's smooth. We don't care. It's not as important. 12, we actually landed in the ocean of storms, another ocean, more rugged than the Sea of Tranquility. And 12 landed in a place where the Surveyor spacecraft, a robotic spacecraft, had been sent up and landed on the moon a few years earlier. And we had to see if we could make a pinpoint landing, get close enough to it to go get parts off of that Surveyor. And they did. They cut pieces and wires and cameras and all kinds of things off and brought them back for study on how they had fared in the lunar atmosphere and the lunar conditions, extreme hot, extreme cold. 14 was even in a more rugged area, as in an area called Fra Mauro, and was really a success, highly successful. Then those 3 missions that I pointed out at the end, the J missions, went way high, way up here on 15, to what they call the highlands, and landed at a place called Hadley Rill, which was very, very rugged. It has a canyon in it bigger than our Grand Canyon on Earth by a lot. And so geologists and lunar scientists like to see rough places so they can see the substrata. They don't like oceans where it's flat. They like it where it's rugged. 16, we went down here to an area called Descartes. And Descartes was very rugged. Another good sample of the moon and how it was made up. And then 17, we went high again up to a place called Torres Litro, probably the most rugged area we landed in. Had boulders as big as houses in it. So that's people say, well, you covered the front face. We had no capability to land on the back side. Couldn't do it. And so what we did, if you put those landings on the Earth, and I've posted here on Europe, you'd run from United Kingdom up here in the Highlands to down here to Portugal and down to the Med and up to northern Germany. And that's about it. So it wasn't a huge area that we explored. If you laid that in the United States on the East Coast, those of you familiar with geography over here, we would have gotten out to about Arkansas from the East Coast. So not very far to the American West. The point is that we had 6 landings, but we didn't cover the moon by any stretch of the imagination. There's still a lot more about the moon we don't know as we do know. So finally, December 72, this is Gene Cernan, gave a final salute. That's the rover tire behind his backpack. I wish he'd gotten a little farther forward. We could have seen the lunar module flag and the rover, but you can see a little bit of a tire on the rover right behind him. One thing, notice how dirty he is. This is something we have to work on the next time we get back to the moon. The moon surface is covered with something they call the regolith. Forget that, it's dirt. It's very fine dirt, almost like graphite or pumice or something, very, very flour. And when you get it on a suit like this, they tried to brush it off and it would just push it into the fabric. So there's a lot of work being done on trying to clean that up when we go back to the moon. This is a favorite picture of mine. It was taken on Apollo 8 by a guy I flew with later in a fighter squadron, or before this, I flew with him in a fighter squadron, a guy named Bill Anders. And he took this picture the first time they saw the moon or the Earth rise as they came around the lunar surface at Christmas. And he said something afterwards that I always has stuck with me. He said, we came to explore the moon and discovered the Earth. which I think is kind of a neat. Every astronaut that went to the moon talked about how fragile this little blue ball looked. And they realized with their thumb, they could cover up everything they had ever known in their lives. All the people, all the countries, all the history, all of that, they could cover it up with their thumb. And they all commented on that. So I said, in many ways, Apollo, we went to explore it, but we really found the moon. Now I want to shift gears and talk about the people. Mission ops. By the way, I've got a shirt on here that has the same patch on it. And those of us that were in mission control like to wear it when we can. So this was a good excuse. The Latin on the top is achievement through excellence. I hope I got that. It's what we keep saying, and I hope some of you are probably Latin students and are probably going to call me wrong. But anyway, that was our patch that we lived by. Mission control existed in this building. It was called Building 30 at the Johnson Space Center. It was my home for 9 years, 9.5 years. And later, we named it. It was renamed the Christopher C. Kraft. Chris Kraft was, you're going to see a picture of him in a minute, but he was really the father of flight control. He started it in Mercury. He was my mentor. He was the guy that made me what I am. And I think I owe a great deal to him. He just died last year at the age of 95, still going strong. But so here's how I got started. I went to Texas A&M University. And the reason I went there is because I wanted to study to be an aeronautical engineer, and I wanted to fly. And at that time, A&M was a total military school. It had a Corps cadets that I was in. I was an officer in the Corps my senior year. And my last year, my third year, fourth year, Lucia and I had a conversation. We call it the senior year is your last year in college. But anyway, my older brother was 9.5 years older, had been a pilot in World War II, a B-17 pilot. He was 19 years old. And I thought he was bigger than anything. He was actually about 5'9", but I thought he was a giant. And I wanted to be like him. I wanted to do what he had done, go into the military and fly. And I thought maybe the way to do that is go to A&M, which was available, study aeronautical engineering, and get a commission. Well, I did. I got commissioned as a second lieutenant when I graduated in the Air Force. And I ended up in a fighter squadron flying in this F-101B Voodoo supersonic airplane. Carried 2 nuclear air-to-air missiles, 1.5 kilotons each, and 2 heat-seeking general explosive missiles. I was 23 years old. 23 years old, and I was, in charge of this complex airplane with weapons of destruction, which luckily never did have to fire in anger. As soon as I was in that fighter squadron when NASA was formed, and I decided that's where I really want to be. I want to go to mission control. It took me a little while to get there. I had more time in the Air Force. I had to serve. I served for a short time with Lockheed Martin in a robotic defense satellite, the early versions of spy satellites in California. I kept trying to get to NASA, and I finally made it. I was a flight controller in Gemini. I was a guidance, navigation, and control guy. And after the fire, Chris decided he needed 3 more flight directors, and he reached down and plucked me out of the crowd and said, "You're going to be a flight director for Apollo." I said, "Yes, sir." So I was. And after Apollo, I went to headquarters and did some other things, 2 other NASA centers. I came back to the Johnson Space Center to be the director of the center and have charge of all the whole thing. And at that time, we had just started flying the shuttle. So I got in on the shuttle business before I retired, but I can't claim a lot of credit for the development of it because I was off doing other things for NASA at that point at headquarters and 2 other centers. I took over at JSC at Johnson Space Center after the 5th mission of the shuttle. That was STS-5. And there I am with the mentor and his subject in 1982. He was retiring and I replaced him. I always told him I never could replace you, I just succeeded you. And but anyway, he was a great, great friend. Control centers all looked alike in a way. This is the only one that was not in Houston. The one called Mercury was at Cape Canaveral. And we flew all of the Mercury flights from that Mercury Control Center at the Cape. And we flew the first 3 Gemini flights, which only one of them was manned from there. And then we shifted to Houston for Gemini and Apollo. You'll see on the right at the upper, and that's the room we flew all of the Gemini in and all of the Apollo. We actually had 2 floors, but they were identical. And then the space shuttle on the lower left, you can see it looks very similar. They took the tiers. It was no longer tiered consoles. It was on a flat floor. And the International Space Station, this picture on the lower right was taken not very long ago. And I don't know what the age is like in this. It's probably a little older. But let me tell you about the Gemini Control Center. And I'm going to tell you, kind of using me as an example. Most of these guys you're looking at are in their 20s. And this is not the Gerry Griffin show, but I want to use me as an example. There's that picture again that you saw earlier. This was my first flight as a flight director. I'm 33 years old. I had been in the control center already 4 years. And so I'm 33 years old. I'm one of the oldest guys in the room. Here's the 5 flight directors that worked on Apollo 11. We had 4 shifts. We used 4 shifts quite often. But for Apollo 11, which was the first landing, we double manned the flight director console. That was me and Cliff Charlesworth, the guy that's, I'm going to put our ages up here. I was 34. Cliff was 37. We actually teamed up and had 2 flight directors on because we were responsible for the launch from Earth and the translunar injection, the burn that sent us on to the moon. And we were also responsible for the lunar surface activity, the extra EVA, we called it. Now, all of us except, 3 of us, me at 34, Gene at 35, Gene Kranz sitting down. He's the guy that wore the vest all the time. You'll see him later in some pictures. Milt Winter, we were all in the Air Force, and we had all flown. So we were probably 3 to 4 years older than the other people in the control center. Cliff had come up through the ranks, and so had Glenn. Glenn was the youngest at 32. Cliff Charlesworth at 37 was the oldest guy in the crowd. And again, here we are, and I'm age 34. This was on the Apollo 11. It just landed back on Earth. And we were celebrating. That's when we brought out the flags. And I actually had that cigar in my mouth, and it was lit. It was burning. And I hated cigars. But anyway, it was the tradition. And but most of the people that you're looking at, particularly down there in the front of the room, were in their 20s. Very young crowd. Here I am on Apollo 12. I was the lead flight director. I'm going to talk about this flight a little bit here in a second because I had a big problem, big issue. And I was 34 years old. Here's Kraft. who at this time sat at this console behind us, who was the director of flight operations. So he was my immediate boss. And I'm going to tell you a story about what we were saying in this picture here. But again, young guys. Here was Apollo 13 in 1970. There were four of us. Now we're starting to get a little older. You can see our hairstyles change a little bit as the age of Aquarius, and it was kind of a fun time. I put this one up because you couldn't see Milt's face. This was taken right after they landed on Earth, and we had gotten them back home safely. And I've got a picture of the four of us. I didn't put it in here. Taken 45 years later. Yeah, we don't look quite the same. Kind of interesting. Here's Apollo 14. Getting a little older now. This was the fourth from the end. This is Glenn Lundy here. He was probably coming on to relieve me, and Kranz had probably come in for some reason. There you can see he's got on one of his vests. Now we're up to 15. Hair's getting a little longer, a little more relaxed, looking a little older. This is 15. I was the lead flight director for this flight, and this is where the two guys were out on the surface, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, during one of their excursions. And they had three very long ones, so I don't know which one it was, but it was, and then Apollo 17 was the finale. Kranz is now 39, I'm 37. Neil Hutchinson was a young guy that we knew was going to be a shuttle flight director because we were all going to move on to something different. We were kind of worn out. And I asked Neil to sit with me to kind of get the feel for what it's like to be a flight director, and he did a great job. And it turned out he was the lead flight director for the first shuttle flight some years later. So the message I want to get you out of this is that we were really young. The guy that made one of the most critical calls I'm going to talk about in a second was 23 years old when he made it. He was from Oklahoma, small school, physics major, not an engineer. But anyway, we were really, and then we trained like crazy. We just simulated and simulated and simulated. And our simulation people could throw us trouble, could put problems in, and they could bring us to our knees. We would they would just bury us. And but we gained from that because when the flights were actually easier, except maybe for 13, the flights were easier than the sims. It was like running with combat boots on and then changing to running shoes. It was really much easier to do the real thing. But perhaps our greatest value was our leadership, who trusted all these young people to do it. And that leadership started at the very top. When John F. Kennedy started us and he got assassinated, he was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, and this picture is over his right shoulder on the left of the photo. Both of them were Democrats, Democrat Party. And when Johnson didn't run for re-election, Nixon won against the incumbent, or I've forgotten who he ran against, but he beat him. And so we had a change to the Republican Party. Throughout those three changes, or those two changes with three different people in two parties, the leadership at the White House never wavered. They stayed behind us. Now I'm going to tell you a personal story that shows you what the leadership did. On Apollo 12, I was the flight director for the launch. We got struck by lightning about 35 seconds after we lifted off. And some of you probably have heard that term SCE to aux. I don't know, it's become kind of almost folklore over here. You see it on t-shirts. A young man, when we got hit by lightning, it knocked everything out the spacecraft. All the power, the battery, the re-entry batteries was the only thing left powering. Lights got all dim. Most of the controls became inoperative. The Saturn continued to work, and it was guiding at that point, so we stayed with it. And a young man, who's the 23-year-old from Oklahoma I was telling you about, said, Flight, ask him to try SCE to aux. I had never heard of the switch, signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary instead of normal, is what he was trying to tell me. So we fiddled around. It was kind of a comedy of errors. I said, what? And he said, SCE to aux. Now I turned to the Capcom, who was to speak to the crew, and said, tell him to try SCE to aux. And the Capcom said, what? Because we had never fiddled with that little obscure switch. Well, anyway, we finally got it up to the crew. And Pete Conrad was the commander. And first time he heard it, he said, what the hell is that? Well, it turns out that Alan Bean was the lunar module pilot. He knew where the switch was. And he took it from auxiliary to, or normal to auxiliary. And we got our data back in the control center. And we could see that he had, it's kind of like a power outage at your house when you get struck by lightning, knocks all things off and things have to get reset. We reset the fuel cells, which were providing power, and we got it back up and we went on. This whole time, the vehicle was climbing on the right trajectory, and I kept watching that to make sure we were getting where we should be, not going off course, where we would have had to abort. We didn't want to abort because it was very violent to abort one of these things while you're under powered flights. So we went on to orbit. Now we had a big decision to make. We'd been hit by lightning. We gotten everything back up. It appeared to be okay. But should we go to the moon or should we come home? Just deorbit and come home, not do the big burn to go to the moon. This picture is when Kraft came. This is the kind of leadership we had. He came down and told me, he said, Gerry, we don't have to go to the moon today, but it's your call all the way. He turned around, went back to his own console, which was a way of telling me that he trusted whatever our team came up with, he was going to be comfortable with and he would back it. That was the kind of leadership we had, where you had these young people making these life-determining decisions and being trusted to do it. That's changed today, and it's worrisome to a bit because today there's a lot of, as you know, second guessing, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it was a great example to me, and I didn't even think of it at the time. I thought it was a natural thing. I said, "Oh, okay, Chris, thanks." And but then I got to thinking about it in my later life. What a trust, and it was because we were capable and ready. Leadership story number 2. Apollo 13. We're on our way to the moon. Everything looks good. 200,000 miles from home. We're 40,000 miles to go to the moon. And we went to stir some cryogenic fluids that are super cold, like liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. In 0G, they float around the tank, and it kind of gets in globules instead of being a homogeneous mixture. You have a fan in there that you turned on, and it stirred it up and made it more homogeneous, so it would feed out gaseous the way it was supposed to. Well, when we started to cryo, it was Big Bang. Most of you have seen the movie, which I worked on. We can talk about if we have time. And we didn't know what it had done. This picture that you're looking at right now was taken right after they separated the surface module. They were almost back to Earth. And that's when Jim Lovell said the whole side of the spacecraft has been blown out. And so we didn't know it was that bad and we didn't get these pictures till they they couldn't download them. So we didn't see this picture until they got on the ground. The film was developed, but it was a big explosion of an oxygen tank that killed all of our oxygen supply for the mothership, the command and service module. So turns out that Kranz's team was on duty when this happened. We took them offline. They went away and tried to figure out what to do. We got the crew into the lunar module. Thank goodness it was still with us. Had it not been with us, the mission would have been lost totally. The lunar module is what got us home. So we got them into the lunar module, and the three teams remaining, Wendler and Lonnie and my team, then went into 3.5 days of figuring out how to get them home. And it was a close call. But the closest consumable we had was water. But we had to figure out how to get them home. We were going to slingshot around the moon, and then they were going to go off and land somewhere, if we didn't do something, in the Indian Ocean. So we figured out a way to do this maneuver after we went around the moon in a slingshot fashion, where we could speed it up and get them home a day earlier and put them back in the Pacific, where we had some recovery forces. That was called the PC plus 2, Paracynthian plus 2. PC, think of it in English, think of it point of closest approach to the moon, and 2 hours later. We used the descent engine on the lunar module to make that dock maneuver. And before we did it, we had some other options that were slower. And so Glenn, Lonnie, and I went up to a viewing room on the other floor of the control center. Nobody there except the whole head of NASA, the head of the agency, the head of was a fellow named Tom Payne, Barnavon Brown was there, Chris Kraft was there, Deke Slayton, the head of the astronauts, was there, George Lowe, the program manager. We were looking at the leadership of NASA, these 2 young guys. And we briefed them on our options, and we said, when we got to the end, there were 4 options, and when we got to the end, we said the option we favor is the PC plus 2. And I remember thinking when we made that recommendation, we said, I remember thinking subconsciously, now we're going to find out, well, have you thought about this? And did you do that? Why aren't you going to do that? Which is much the way things get done today. And it didn't happen. In fact, there was total silence. And finally, the head of the agency, the head of NASA, a guy named Tom Payne, looked at us and he said, what can we do to help you? That's all he said. So again, the young guys that were trusted all the way up the line, we trusted them, they trusted us, we trusted the people below us. We said, we think we got it, sir. And we turned around, went back downstairs and went into the control center and did the PC plus 2 burn and got them home just fine. But again here, that's where you have leadership that doesn't try to do it for you. They enable you, empower you, hold you accountable. No doubt about that. But keep that in mind, all of you, as you go into your careers. There's the tendency today that when something goes wrong, we got to bring that decision up a level and let somebody of higher rank make it. And in Apollo, we shoved decisions down as low as we could to the people that really understood what was going on, and not trying to make it in Washington or somewhere else, but make it on the site where it happened. So there was a good lesson in there, and the leadership was very much responsible for allowing the people to be prepared, get ready to go, and then just do it. So what happened after Apollo? I call this the hanging on period. We hung on for a while using some old Apollo hardware that didn't get used. We built Skylab. That's Skylab on the left there is the S2, that's an empty S2 stage off of Saturn. It was made into a laboratory. Then it was visited 3 times by crewmen, and it was very successful. on the right, Apollo-Soyuz was one mission. This was when we were trying to get friendly with the Soviet Union before the wall fell. And we docked up a command and service module with a Soyuz spacecraft. And they swapped, and they became very good friends. Alexei Leonov was the commander for the Soviets, and Tom Stafford for us. They became very good friends. I became very good friends with Leonov. And he's crazy. He's a crazy man. And then there was shuttle. 30 years of shuttle. And this is where spaceflight in many ways kind of came to its own, because this is when we finally did see a lot of nations fly, people from a lot of nations, a lot of women, people of color, all of that. The shuttle was really our coming out in terms of including everyone in the business. It flew 135 missions. We lost 2 of them, Challenger and Columbia, and both times 7 people were killed on each. And those were tragic losses that we learned a lot about, but a lot from them. But they were, of course, it's a risky business. There's no doubt. It's riskier than driving on the freeway, probably, maybe. I use the Hubble because the shuttle hauls so much cargo in space. But Hubble was a great example in what it could do. This thing is close to 60 feet long, and it was stowed in the payload bay and deployed with the arm. And with Canada, arm was made by Canada. And the thing that really impressive about this mission and the capability of the shuttle is they went up later and captured the Hubble, pulled it back into the cargo bay, and in that middle photo at the bottom, you can see astronauts out on the arm. They actually changed out equipment, upgraded it. They actually repaired the mirror. On the first visit, they had to put a contact lens over it because the lens was ground in Germany, and somehow there was a screw up in English or metric, and so it had a distortion. Had a distortion to it, so they went in and put a contact lens on it, and it worked just fine. After that, the Hubble has been very successful, and the shuttle carried up all kinds of satellites, communication satellites, defense satellites, all kinds of things. But I use the Hubble because it really kind of is an example. The shuttle hauled up most of the pieces of the space station, which looks like something like this today. Right there in the top center, there is a Soyuz dock there. But it all ended. In 2011, it ended. And then for the next almost 10 years, we flew with the Russians in the Soyuz, could carry 3 people. The U.S. paid $80 million per seat to get an astronaut to the space station. That's finally ended, hopefully. Although it could be, if the next slide I show you, start on the left, last May 30th, we launched the first time the SpaceX Falcon Dragon with 2 guys aboard, 2 astronauts. The picture on the lower left is the first stage that was recovered on a barge out in the Atlantic and brought back into port to be reused again. The middle pictures are, top one is the docking with the space station. And the middle picture, they're coming through the hatch, the 2 guys, and they joined the 3 guys that were already in the space station. And in that bottom picture, and then the pictures on the right are the recovery when they came down into the ocean, and actually came down in the Gulf of Mexico, and were hauled in, and it was very successful. Now, if all goes well, day after tomorrow, Saturday, the second SpaceX Falcon Dragon with a crew in it will be launched, and they'll have 4 astronauts in it to go to the space station. So, what's next? The first major goal is to go back to the moon and put the first woman and the next man, and that's the way they say it. It is possible that we'll make that by mid-decade this year. Second goal is to go on to Mars, and that's going to take a longer time. Who knows? But we're going to do it with Artemis. Artemis is the twin sister, by the way. That name is Apollo had a twin sister in Greek mythology, and Artemis was her name. And it's going to use the Space Launch System. These are all artist rendering. The SLS, the Space Launch System, hasn't flown yet, but the parts are coming together. It's about to. Uses some shuttle technology with solid rockets on the side of it. Saturn class lifts a lot. Orion, up at the top in the middle, there is the spacecraft. It's a Apollo Command Module on steroids. It's just bigger and more better. The Lunar Gateway is a station that they're going to put in lunar orbit to help them sustain time there. That might get axed. We may go back to the moon just the way we did before. And then the lunar lander, which is my last slide, or TBD, that's under the commercial sector is going to do that now. And there's 3 contracts out. One is Blue Origin, and this is their company rendition of what theirs might look like, a lander on the moon. Dynetics, a company in Huntsville, Alabama, is another. Their artist rendering of what they're going for. And then this is SpaceX again, just a plain old rocket-looking device. And that's what they're proposing, and they're actually building one of these things right now. I'm going to go through these very fast. There's just, in the meantime, a lot of commercial activity has gone on. We've got existing launch vehicles that have been in business for a long time. They grew out of the old intercontinental ballistic missile, but these have been launching satellites, payloads for all kinds of countries. You have, at ESA, you've got the Ariane set of rockets that do the same thing. New commercial rockets, I put the Falcon family in there by SpaceX. Northrop Grumman has designed one called Antares. Blue Origin, and they've flown. Blue Origin hasn't flown yet with New Glenn. But we have a mixture here. Cygnus on the lower left has flown. It's just a cargo hauler. It's flown on Antares, has flown to the space station. The Dragon on the lower right has not only flown to the space station, now it's gone into orbit on, it's going to go into orbit on its own. It flew cargo to the space station first. The top two, the left one, the Starliner is a people hauler. It won't go beyond Earth orbit. And the one on the right, the Dream Chaser, is also a cargo hauler, and it won't go below Earth orbit. All of these are being built, and all are being scheduled to fly. So those are commercial spacecraft. So here's what I think is going to happen. Human spaceflight to low Earth orbit is going to be the domain of the current and new commercial companies. I think they're going to own getting to low Earth orbit. And I think human spaceflight is going to remain the primary domain of the governments. And I should have put an S on here. And it's going to be highly dependent on the stability of the international partners' funding, NASA's, and we got to have some stable funding if this is going to work. So that's it. We can take a question, or I can go through the movies real fast if you want me to. Give me a sign, Lucia. Should I go through the movies? You probably can't hear me. Maybe you can't talk. Let me do it real fast anyway. I first worked on Apollo 13. I was a technical advisor. Ron Howard contacted some of us and said, let's get together and I want to see if I'm going to make a movie out of Apollo 13. And when we met him, he had Tom Hanks with him, and he had Kevin Bacon, and he had Bill Paxton, and they had a gazillion questions. And when they left, I thought they were not going to make a movie because they kept asking us. There were 6 of us that had worked on it. Said, "Were you scared?" And we said, "No, we weren't scared. We were trained, and we were ready to face it." And he said, "You mean there was no emotion?" And we looked at each other and said, "No, we just got it done." But anyway, made a film out of it. I got about 30 days later, I got a call and said, "Do you want to be a technical advisor on the movie?" And I said, "Sure." And I didn't know what it meant. Well, it meant about 6 months out of my life and 6 months in Hollywood. And but it was a hoot. I learned a lot about movie making. And the funny thing about this movie is that every time we had a break, Tom Hanks wanted to talk about the real flight. And every time we had a break, I wanted to ask them, why are we breaking? Why are we stopping? Why don't we keep going here? And so I was trying to learn how they make a movie, and he was trying to learn what the real flight was like. That led to me working on Contact with Jodie Foster. Great movie, I think. And she was a delight to work with Matthew McConaughey. And I spent time with her alone before we started shooting, going through the script, and what a neat person, very, very capable. And this was the first fiction movie I had worked on, and that was different, but it was fun. And I got put in front of the camera on Contact, so I ended up getting paid as a technical advisor and as an actor. And so if you have a chance, buy those DVDs, because I'm still getting residual payments. So anytime you can spend money on Contact or Deep Impact, the next one I got on camera, that was, anytime you can buy those two, buy them, because this was with Robert Duvall. Deep Impact was Robert Duvall, a real treat also. A lot different than Jodie Foster, but quite the actor. And it was about a comet that hits the Earth and so forth and so on. So you better pick that one up. Now that one I got in front of the camera, and so I just got to say one more time: buy those DVDs, buy it online, whatever you have to do. My last one was done in 2011, and this was different. Made in Canada, shot in Canada. It started out normal and then ends up paranormal, and it's far out, and it's different. I don't get any residuals on that one, so don't feel compelled. Anyway, that's it. Let's take some questions, and on any topics you want to talk about, and I will stop sharing.
We'll begin with the questions from the people. I actually have some questions from some partnering societies. So first up,
okay,
we have some questions first up from KCL Space. So it's the Space Society from UCL, and the first question they have is, if NASA received the same percentage of the national budget it had in the 60s, what do you think modern aerospace would look like today?
It would be a lot different. At the height of Apollo, the NASA budget was roughly 1% of the annual budget, and it stayed that way through the end of Apollo. Today, it is less than half of 1% of the national budget, and it's going down. I really think, and even when I got to Washington after I had left Apollo, and I was the head of legislative affairs for the agency. Why they got an engineer from Texas A&M to do that, kind of hard to explain. But I was working the Hill. I was working the Congress, and I kept trying to make, if we could just keep something like 75.75 or 1% of the national budget, we could do amazing things. This thing, we would have been to Mars already, I'm convinced. But what happened was, when we started Apollo, we had a balanced budget in this country. We were not running a deficit. And so we started from a great financial position for public funding. By the time we got to the end of Apollo, the Vietnam War had taken its toll. We had a lot of campus unrest, civil rights. In fact, that's an interesting topic sometime to discuss, because I told somebody I had a twin brother that was flying in Vietnam, and I kind of missed his war because I was so busy with Apollo. Now, we kept in contact through letters because there was no email in those days. But I also kind of missed the story in a way, not totally, but I missed the story of the civil rights movements of the 60s, because I could only catch flashes of it. I couldn't focus on it because we were working 24/7, flight after flight after flight. Those Gemini flights, for instance, came every 6 weeks. So it's very rapid. But I think if the budget had just stayed anywhere near where it was, we would be much, much further ahead today. The other thing we should have done, and I think we all recognize that now, we should have built an international coalition earlier. We've got it now. It's the international partners are working together very well. We don't have China in it, and the Russians tend to go off on their own, although they're playing a pretty good role in the space station. So we've gotten kind of pretty good at dealing with them. But between the budget and if we had established those international partners a little bit earlier, I think we would, the answer to the question, we'd be a lot further ahead now than we are.
Yeah, about it, I also remember, for example, when I was in the conference, I was twice to the conference. And for people who don't know, NASA has this contest, a NASA Space Settlement Design Contest. And I remember in my first year of being at the conference, where you have to present your project, when I won the honorable mention, we were told to not, to cover our NASA logos, because it was some sort of a protest because of the budget problems. And NASA has, I remember, some issues with the administration. I think it was Trump administration, and they actually asked us to cover the NASA logos because they were protesting, so they could not appear as if they're funding.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was.
Oh my! I didn't know that one.
It was. I think it was 2017. 2017. Yeah.
I met you in 2019.
And afterwards I did not win anything in 2018. Then in 2019 I went on with the first prize. And then the contest, which was founded by NASA, now it was for NSS, the National Space Society. Yeah, but I remember some problems with budget. Also, we have another question still from UCL Space. In your opinion, Mr. Griffin, are space agencies still competitive in the current space race towards Mars, for example, against private space companies like SpaceX? Well,
if I understood the question correctly, and you broke up a little bit there, but I think I understand. Going back to the moon and on to Mars is going to be a partnership. It's not going to be done alone. We can't do it alone, particularly Mars. And Mars, we're a long way from going to Mars because we still got to figure out how to protect the crew from radiation. That's probably the biggest barrier right now to going to Mars is radiation protection. When you get out into free space, the gamma rays are so powerful, they're cosmic rays. The human body just can't take it. And so they're working on all kinds of shielding. Turns out, by the way, just a side note on that, water is a good barrier if you can do it well. They're looking at a double wall spacecraft that you would fill with water from not lift off with it full, but on your way to Mars, fill it with the fuel cell water. And I don't know whether that'll work or not, but they're trying to think of all kinds of things. But back to your basic question, I think it's going to take a number of countries. I think ESA will play a major role. I don't think there's any doubt Japan will. Canada will be in there, I can tell you. Australia has just set up a space agency about a year ago. Never had one, and they want to get on with it. So, yeah. Now, did I answer the question, or did I hear the wrong question?
I think so. No, I think so.
Because you were broken up a little bit.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Okay. Maybe the internet connection. Yeah, but no, it's fine.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm ready. Far away.
We have some questions from a society from King's College London, KCL Tech. We have some questions from them. So the first one would be, how did you realize that this is something you wanted to make what was your job about? How did you decide to actually work for NASA and be an engineer at NASA?
I was in, as I had said earlier, I was in the Air Force, and I happened to be home the morning that Al Shepard, who was the first guy we put on one of the Redstone missiles, the little ones, and just lobbed them about 300 miles down the Atlantic. But I was there for that. I hadn't gone into the squadron yet. And when I saw that launch, it was black and white television, a little screen, I thought, that is it. That is going as high and as fast as you can go. So I want to be a part of that. I knew I was probably not going to be an astronaut from the get-go because I hadn't been through that test pilot regime that everybody they selected in those early years were test pilots. There was one of those, so it'd be futile. So I said, I'm going for mission control. And I had seen pictures of the Cape, and I thought, God, that'd be fun to be a part of that. So it literally was, when I graduated from college, there was no space program. In fact, my degree is aeronautical engineering because there was no aerospace curriculum. Nowadays, aerospace curriculums, when you get out of that, you understand orbital mechanics and how you get into orbit and get out of it, and change it. So we literally had to learn it on the job of what an orbit was. I didn't even know, had to figure out, how do you stay in orbit? You know what? Then it finally, and in NASA, we had some physicists and astronomers that were in our midst, and they helped a lot because they understood the physics of the solar system at least. So anyway, I'll try to keep my answer short because I know I can see a lot of questions.
One more question from KCL Tech. How many people does it take in total to be successfully in a complete mission for NASA? How many people work together for a mission?
Oh, you're talking about on the ground?
Yeah.
I assume that question means
I think
mission control. Yeah, there's the positions in the control center probably number in the neighborhood of 25, smaller than you think, 25, maybe 28. But there are back rooms outside of that probably have 3 times that many. So that's 100 people, maybe 75 outside and 25 inside. That's 100 people right there. Now, that would be the number of people it would take per shift when it was high activity. Now, when you get to a space station operation where there's no maneuvering going on and it's going around in orbit, things are stable, that can be cut back. But for the launch phase and rendezvous and things like that, where you have to have ground support, you're probably talking 100 people, and maybe on that whole, I'm trying to think, that might take, in order to put 100 people in there, you probably got an organization that's got 300 or 400 people, probably 3 or 4 times that many. So that would be my guess.
Nice.
Oh,
Lucia, are there any more from societies? Lucia, are there any more from societies? Any more questions?
Lucia, you hear him?
Yeah, sorry, I could not unmute myself.
No.
Because of the fact that only Nikita is the host and I could not unmute myself unless he allowed me to.
Yeah.
Yes, we also have some questions, just some 2 quick questions from KCL Space before we begin with the questions from the audience, if that's fine, but they will ask the questions themselves if they're in the meeting now. So again, we have KCL Space.
Are they going to be asking it in the chat? Or
Yeah, they no, they said they will ask now.
Do it via voice.
Okay, I don't see anyone from KCL Space yet, so let's go to the audience first.
Sure.
Oh, no, actually, we have someone named Aditya, sorry, I don't exactly know the name, how to pronounce it, and he has to be unmuted, if you can.
Second. Just Aniba or Verma? What's her second name? Bird 2.
1 second.
No worries.
Verma. Okay, yep.
Brilliant. Aditya, we've just...
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, good. You are on.
There you are.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
So first of all, I'm a big fan. I just want to ask you what kind of role the lunar orbit rendezvous played in bringing them back in the mission, and how the decision was taken to discard Earth orbit rendezvous and the direct method approach.
Yeah, what the question is there is, should we do an Earth rendezvous in Apollo and put the 2 vehicles together and go on to the moon, or should we do a rendezvous in the lunar orbit run? You know, let me say first, that was before my time. While I was still trying to get to the agency. But there was a pretty heated battle, as you probably, if you studied it, probably know that there were a lot of people that thought it would be much safer to do it in Earth orbit and not do it at the moon. But it worked out, I think, just fine. And I'd like to say I was not a part of it. It was just kind of handed to me when I walked in the door. So my only study of it, I came to a quick conclusion. It works, so let's not argue about it. And but it was, and a lot of it depended on, I think, some of the early estimates of how much power they were going to have, propulsion power, lifting power, and all of that. I think there were a number of questions in that regard, and they were just trying to figure out, how do we do it? And it turns out, I think it was perfect. But the secret was the Saturn V could lift everything that needed to go to the moon with one launch. And I think early on there was a question, can we do that? Can you pick up a lunar module and a Apollo command service module and with just one launch vehicle and loaded? And sure enough, it worked out just fine. You must have studied it.
Yeah, a little bit on the side. So did it play a role in the way Apollo 13 turned out, like how we brought them back, how you guys brought them back? So
yeah,
did it play a role in that?
Yeah, I think it did. I think, one thing about Apollo 13, and I mentioned it before, if we had to have an explosion, it happened at exactly the right place because we had a fully loaded lunar module. And we had talked in the control center, we had talked about using the lunar module as a lifeboat, but we never had simulated it. We just talked about Yeah, you got a lot of battery power, you got a lot of water, got a lot of oxygen. It could probably be a lifeboat if you needed it. That's about as far as we got. On Apollo 9, which we flew in Earth orbit, we actually fired the descent engine in a dock configuration, which we had to do for the PC+2 burn. And we just did it because the program wanted to do it, not thinking that we'd use it one day at the moon or to get home from the moon. But I'm thinking it was good that we did it because we knew it could be done. And then we had all that. You know, your first impression would be we lost our oxygen tank, so the short consumable is going to be oxygen. You know, we're not going to have enough oxygen to get them home. Well, it turned out that was not true at all. We had plenty of oxygen. Actually, we had a lot of battery power in the lunar module, but what we didn't have was water. And the fuel cells put hydrogen and oxygen together, and it puts out electricity and water. And that water is very pure. You drink it, you mix food with it, you cool electronics, radiators with it, use it for all kinds of things. We rationed those guys down coming home. They were only drinking about 6 to 8 ounces of water per day. And they got very, very dehydrated. And in fact, Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, got a very bad urinary tract infection. He was running a fever when they landed. So water turned out to be, we had about 16 hours of water left when they hit the ocean. So we didn't have much more water to play with. But yeah, it did play a role. The way we had the mission structured saved us in Apollo 13.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now I will start off with the questions from the chat and then with people with raised hand. So I will start off with a question for the chat, then with someone with a raised hand, then another question from the chat, and so on. So first, was Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon the factor which decided the winner of the space war?
It was the final factor, because even though we know now the Soviets had kind of dropped out because of their big loss, we still hadn't done it either. And so it was for sure when he landed, actually, I think when he landed on the moon was almost as important as when he stepped out. Because just putting humans on the moon, even in a spacecraft, was such an audacious and giant thing to do that it really, I think it was a great step. But Neil stepping out on onto the surface was probably the moment that people will always remember. And he was such a good guy. I was going to talk a little about him, but I ran out of. He was one of my. I'll take the opportunity right now. I can make it fast. He was a guy that you would want to know. He was very, very humble. Very. He was a quiet guy. And if you've seen the movie, The Last Man, which came out last year, I think. Don't believe the character that Neil Armstrong, how they depict him. They depict him as being kind of weak and wimpy. He was not that at all. He was quiet and reserved. But I have seen him in a room, a meeting of 100 people, and he would wait till everybody else almost had said their thing, and there would always be talking going on. And maybe finally in the back of the room, Neil would raise his hand, and whoever was running would say, "Neil, you got something?" Everybody would get quiet, and they would listen to what he said, because every time he spoke, he nailed it. he made it right on the money. And what a great guy to be the first person to step on the moon. And so anyway, great guy, and big moment when he stepped out.
That's absolutely amazing, and to listen to someone who actually met Neil Armstrong, that's mind-blowing to me. Next, we have a question from Oshin Vaz. If Nikita, could you please unmute?
Okay.
Come again?
Oshin Vaz, I think it is.
Oshin Vaz. Okay, there we go.
So if you could.
Okay, Oshin, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin, first off, it is an absolute honor to hear you talk. I am a huge fan. Now, my question is in regards to the end of the Apollo project. Now, this is a very controversial opinion, but I remember in high school, my physics teacher once called the ending of the Apollo project to be the greatest squandering of scientific advantage ever, because we had the entire cosmos in our grasp almost. I mean, we had a moon. We could have expanded. I mean, ice was found on the moon just 5 years after the Apollo project ended. Do you agree with that opinion, or do you think the Apollo project terminated at the right time?
Well, mixed emotions. Let me give you a personal story. I showed that picture on Apollo 17 of Neil Hutchinson, the young guy that was going to be the shuttle flight director. And I never will forget this. This moment is chiseled in my brain. We had finished the mission at the moon. We had done trans-Earth injection, so we were headed back to Earth. And those coasting periods going out and coming back, except for Apollo 13, were usually very quiet and calm. So I took a calm moment that we were coming back from the moon on 17, last mission. And I never will forget, the guys kind of came up around, if the crew was asleep, and they came up around my console, and they were just standing, and we were chatting, and I stood up, and we were talking about the future and so on. And I remember saying, you know, maybe it's not so bad that this is the last flight, because 20 years from now, we're going to be on Mars. That was 1972. We didn't quite make 1992 to get to Mars. But I thought, and I really agree with what you say, or that opinion, because if we had kept going, we had it in our grasp. We could have done it. We had, and let me give you another example. We got to Apollo largely because of World War II. We had built a giant aviation industry, and and now we were building not only military airplanes, but commercial airplanes and so on and so on. So we had this workforce of engineers and tradesmen, craftsmen that could build and weld and so forth. And actually, we just kind of moved some of them right over into the Apollo program. So we had this new environment. The space was going to have to be, you're going higher and you're going faster, and you're going to be in a very hostile environment. You had to learn how to do that. But a message for all of you: the space business is still a nuts and bolts business. It's not a mysterious thing. Some of the places we're trying to go are a little mysterious, but the hardware and software that it takes to do it are there. So we had that database. At the end of Apollo, now we had not only that database that was still there, we also had a space-related database of people, manufacturers, folks throughout the world that had gotten on board. and then we went back to Earth orbit in the shuttle. And if we almost, I think, turned everything down at that point. Earth orbit is not easy. It's hard to get to Earth orbit. That's the first step you got to go through to get to the moon. But it's nothing like deep space. It's nothing like trying to operate in deep space. And so we should have gone on. But the earlier question that someone asked about the funding, it just wasn't there. And the commercial people took them a long time to start investing their own money like they had in airplanes back in 1930s. And in fact, I can remember when I was director at the JSC, Johnson Space Center, I was always see the people that built the command and service module, Rockwell. It was then a North American Rockwell before that, North American before that. And they would come to see me occasionally, their leadership, and I said, why don't you guys spend some of your own money and get in the space business yourself? And their answer was always, oh, our stockholders wouldn't like that. It's too big a risk. So it took people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and people that had some money to put at it. I've met both of those gentlemen. They're different, but they put their money where their mouth is, and they got lots of it. And Jeff Bezos, I heard him talking to a group of his employees. He's the Amazon guy he owns Amazon. But Jeff was talking to his employees, and he said, I'll remind you, this was the space employees, this is a for-profit business. I'm not going to keep putting money into it unless we can make a profit. And they're starting to show some now. But somebody asked him, a press guy asked him, well, how do you fund this? And he said, I sell $1 billion of Amazon stock a year to put into space activities. And so anyway, I think it probably took somebody kind of like that now the big companies, the Boeings and Lockheed Martin, they're getting it. They say, okay, we're going to have to put some of our money if we're going to compete with these guys in the future. And Grumman, Northrop Grumman, it is now, actually joined the Blue Origin, the Jeff Bezos team, to build that lander. And of course, they built a lunar lander on the first one, so they probably are going to be damn good. And but I think it's a good point. We should have gone on. I thought we would. That's why at the time I wasn't thinking that bringing Apollo to an end was all that bad, because we were going to go on, but we didn't. Long answer.
But very interesting.
To be honest, I threw my physics professor under the bus, but it was actually me who said that. They squandered it. It was just, I didn't want to get you upset at me if you didn't agree with it. Thank you for your honest assessment, Mr. Griffin. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one question from the chat from Rafi Dreyer. Do you feel the change in approach as to who the decision makers were after Apollo led to the shuttle disasters?
Probably not. In fact, it may have. And they're two separate accidents, so and they have slightly different answers. I think the Challenger accident is the one that, when we were going up after launch, a seal between two segments of the solid rock failed. And when it failed, hot gases coming out there, it's like a welding torch. And it ended up tearing up that whole end of the vehicle. And you had liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen in those tanks, and all you got to do is put those together and you get the big fireball that we saw. that joint, the solid rockets that were on each side came in 4 segments. That was because those segments were poured in Utah, way out west, and actually transferred solid propellant, transferred to the Cape on rail cars, and then they were stacked. And they had to be stacked very carefully, and those seals, these aren't small, I mean, they were huge. That seal was always tough to make sure it worked right, O-rings and all that. The design, the initial design was marginal. It worked fine for 25 or 24 flights, but they were already working on a new design change. There was a lot made of the fact that it was launched on a cold day, and that the temperature was the primary cause. And this is personal opinion, Gerry Griffin. I think we would have lost that rocket on a 100-degree day, Fahrenheit. I mean, we would have, I think it could have been a very warm day, and that was a bad joint. By the time they launched that morning, it was up to about 37, 38 degrees. It had been freezing, down to freezing overnight. But that seal was very hard, and the design was such that it was hard to make sure you had not crimped one of the O-rings. And they fixed it. The design finally fixed it. But the decision to go was not made from higher up. It was made down low, or it was made by the project manager that on the solid rocket. And he knew more about, I know him well, he's recently passed away, but named Larry Malloy. He got right through the coals because he said, let's go. And some people at the contractor that built those did not want to go. They said, no, we ought to wait and let it warm up. So that was not a case of decisions, I think, being shoved up to somebody that didn't know what they were doing. In the case of Columbia, we had a piece of foam come off of the external tank, a big chunk in it. The external tank, that orange thing that you see in, was like a thermos bottle. And it was covered with foam on the outside that was sprayed on about this thick. It was much tougher than the styrofoam that you see in a cup or on a cooler. And a big chunk came off and hit the leading edge of the wing, which was made out of reinforced carbon, which was about a ½ inch thick and was tough as a boot. And when I was out of NASA by that, in fact, I was in Washington, and I got called into a news program on ABC, and I was asked if I thought the foam could have been a problem. I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think the foam's a problem. That reinforced carbon is like steel. It's heavy. I picked up a section of it once, hardly pick it up. And I don't think that foam would do it. Well, guess what? They took it to a place here in Texas, Southwest Research Institute. They took the amount of foam they thought was about the size because they could see the photographs where this chunk came off. And they calculated it was doing 800 feet a second when it delta velocity, change velocity. When it hit, guess what? It blew a hole in that reinforced carbon.
Whoa.
And there was no way to know. You can't see the leading edge from the cockpits. There's no way to look back. And so they started re-entering, and it was always fine. But then the hot gases of re-entry were going into the wing and turned it in, and eventually that wing came off and the whole thing came apart. Now, that decision, the only decision you could claim on that one, that some people said, well, they should have done an EVA and gone out and looked at it to see if it had a hole. Well, for one thing, nobody knew for sure that even what it was for a long time. And then secondly, there was no they hadn't trained. There was no way to do that EVA. They weren't prepared to do it. After that, they had an inspection that they actually put on the arm of the Canada arm, and they could go around and look at the leading edge, both wings, and just look at it physically to make sure it was okay. We also never had another chunk of foam that big come off the tank. Chunks of that foam had come off on almost every flight, but little pieces. This was one time that a pretty good sized chunk did. So I don't think either one of those accidents were a result of decision making level. You might question the decision, but we call that in the States Monday morning quarterbacking. It's easy to call the play next time if you know what happened the first time. So, and I hope I answered your question. That's another long answer. I'll try to shorten them up.
Yeah, I think there are too many questions. I'm not sure we'll be able to go through all of them.
Well, we'll go for a while.
We have a question from Fiona McAllister, and she wants to put the questions herself.
Okay.
Nikita, could you please unmute her? So it's Fiona McAllister.
Hiya. Hi, I'm Fiona. First of all, I want to say thank you for hosting this talk. It's been an absolute delight. I've actually got a couple of questions because my flatmate, unfortunately, he's not here, but he wanted to ask you a question as well, and they're linked. So one of the things you mentioned is that during the Apollo era, both sitting presidents were Democrats. Do you think things would have been different with a Republican president? And if so, what are the primary differences in the approach to space by the Democrats versus the Republicans?
Actually, both parties have been very supportive. Now, we've had different presidents that kind of had a blind eye, and I think they just kind of let their people handle it, and let somebody else do it. And then we've had some that have been very much hands-on, like Kennedy in the early days. And even Johnson, who came behind him, he was the first president I ever met, came into the control center. So the political parties were different. I do remember, you can feel the liberal conservative difference. I remember meeting with a senator, it's now gone, and his name was Metzenbaum. He was from Ohio, and the deputy administrator and I went to the Hill to meet with him, make a courtesy call, and I never forget, he was kind of a grouchy-looking guy anyway, but I think he was okay, but he just looked grouchy. Anyway, we were talking away there, and we made our spiel and gave him our spiel, and he looked at us and he said, "What do you think space flight can do for my people in the inner city of Cleveland?" I mean, that was his way of thinking, is that, and I could tell, and I knew we were barking up, as we say, barking up the wrong tree. That wasn't, we would never count on Senator Metzenbaum's vote, because he didn't think that you ought to spend anything on such silly stuff, that it ought to go to socials and kind of hand it out. And we tried to make the point, that look, we're trying to push the envelope here, and the more we learn, and we don't know, and of course you can't there was a lot of spin-offs from the space program, but you can't make the program stand on its own on that. Those are just good things to do, like our cell phone. Miniaturization of electronics really had to happen in the space business, and it taught us how to do it. So anyway, I don't think there's a lot of difference in the mainstream of both parties. I think they want us to excel. I think they'd like to see us have a robust space program, but it generally comes back to money, and that's why I'm glad to see the the commercial people getting into it, because it does take some of the pressure off the government to fund everything. And I'd like to see commercial guys do more and leave the governments, plural, to look into deep space, the harder missions, the ones where you have to do new things. And that's what we ought to be doing. Now, you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, so my friend Mo wants to ask what you think about the fact that the Biden administration is about to take the focus away from lunar missions and instead invest towards climate change. So he's wondering what your opinions on that are.
Well, I could talk all afternoon on that one. I won't. But I think it's a mistake. I think the small amount of money that we are putting toward, and I had a chart earlier that talked about stability. They need stability in funding. Not you can learn how to live with a certain figure and then maybe grow it at the GDP growth or something, but stay with just stability. If he comes in and turns down the lunar thing, now there's nothing wrong with using space assets to the extent you can on climate change. But if you just take the ship and say, okay, we're going to take all the load over here and it all on this climate change side and kind of wipe it out, big mistake. Because we may not ever be able to crank it up again. I think what he's going to do, if you look at the details of his stated platform, is that he, quotes, believes in a lunar or deep space exploration, but, and then he puts the but with it, and it's, so I think it's to be seen how much money do they take out of trying to get back to the moon, which is just a first step. Even Mars is just a teeny step in what we've got. And I'm going to take this opportunity to quickly give you a thought that I've had for a long time. Going to the moon was fantastic. In fact, that was 1960s. And trying to get back 50 years later, 50 years since we've been there, it's not going to be an easy task, but we can do it. And when it's all said and done, if you think of what we're really trying to do, I think one day we're going to have to get off this planet if the species is to survive. Now, it's not going to be in your lifetime, it won't be in your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids. It may be 1,000 years from now, it may be 10,000 years from now. But one day, and it's not climate change, we're just going to use it up. And we're going to overcrowd it to the point that, I don't know, maybe it'll fix itself with famine or something. But we're going to outgrow and outuse and use up this planet. We need to be thinking about how to move around out there. And I'll just say out there, if the species is going to survive. And this is just a teeny little step that we're taking. It's not enough in the big picture to even say much about, but if we don't start somewhere, we're going to sit here one day and 10,000 years from now, we're going to be used up and with no place to go. That's one reason the scientists throughout the world are looking at Earth-like possibilities that are out there. And they've found, there are billions of stars, and there's got to be someplace out there that's got some hydrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere that could sustain us. There's some places, good places that look good, but they got methane or CO2 for an atmosphere, so that's not going to work. So I really think that it would be a big mistake to take your eye off that ball too far. And I don't think they will. That was one good thing. One good thing about Pence is that Pence had the vice president, I think, really dug into it and understood space flight and space technology. And this idea of going back, it wasn't his. It came out of the bowels of their administration somewhere. But when Trump put him in charge of it, Vice President Pence really dug into it and understood it. I hope if we'll put Kamala Harris in it, and she understands that, you know, this is not just a bunch of guys going back to the moon. It's men and women. In fact, the crew that's going to launch day after tomorrow is a mixed crew. Got a woman and a black guy and an African American, I guess we're supposed to say. And but you know, I hope if she can get in there, if she's the one, we'll all do our best to try to convince her that it's worthwhile.
Thank you very much.
That's my philosophy on the futurism.
Yeah, I think everyone here can probably agree with that vision.
Yeah. Good.
All right. Now next we have a question from the chat from Nan. So, hello, Mr. Griffin. Learning about spaceflight during the 60s to 80s were the true inspiration for me to pursue mechanical engineering. I have quite a personal question. What was the most important impact do you feel Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz had on your career as a flight director?
Well, I have to separate those because Gene Kranz was more of a peer. He was my boss because he ran the flight director office, which was an administrative role. And Gene and I are still good. We're good friends and highly respect each other. Kraft was one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life. He had a way of, he called us all young man this, young man, do something. He was only about 10 years older than I was. But true leadership is interesting because a leader to me is someone, Chris, not only did we respect him, we wanted to make him look good. I don't know if that makes sense, but we wanted him to be proud of us because we were good. But we really wanted to do well so that he looked good. And he was that kind of magnetic force around him or something that when you got around him, even to the day he died, and we were good friends, I always felt a little bit in awe of him and I've never felt it that way with anybody else at NASA, but Chris brought out that feeling that do your best for him, make him happy, make it pay off. And when it did, it was a wonderful feeling. And I think that's a measure of a true leader. Kranz is, by the way, is more, we called him off and on the Prussian general because he still has the crew cut, which is more than I've got, but he's still got the crew cut, and he was kind of a very militaristic style of speech and all that, but Kranz was good, and he, the funny thing, I can think back, and you all, all of you are gonna line up in the same position someday where we're working 24/7. If you have to do it, you just do it and you enjoy it. I've never enjoyed anything more in my life than walking in that control center. It's like walking into a cathedral and you were going to give the sermon. It was really a special feeling. And I told people, and I tried to get in all the movies I worked in when they showed control center scenes. I said, you see all of us in the real pictures, and we got these stern looks on our face, and like that one with Kraft talking to me. By the way, we never knew those pictures were being taken. Those cameramen got so good they could sneak around and take pictures and videos of us. I never saw them because you were too focused on what you're doing. But I told people that you see us, we got these real serious looks on our face. And yeah, it was serious, but it was a hoot. I said, I just have to tell you, it was so much fun. The challenge is what made the job so fun. And what happened in the control center is that we had a number of people that self-eliminated themselves. The pressure was just too much. I don't remember anybody that got removed from the control center because they weren't getting it. But a number of guys did say, hey, I just seemed to, that the pressure was just too hard. But most of us thrived on that. That's what made it fun, the pressure and the being out on the end of the diving board by yourself and with nobody around, and you had to make the decision. It's like when go on to the moon on Apollo 12 or come home. Let's go, but you did it based on good input, but it was just, God, it was fun. Always fun. And long answer. Another long answer.
Yeah.
My question for you was actually, would you like to go further with the questions? Or?
Would I like to go?
Yep. There are a lot of questions still.
Go on.
Yeah, sure. I would go anytime. Just tell me when to report.
Sure. Okay, well, let's go for another voice question then. This one is from George Lewis Lamb. George, you are...
Hi.
Yes, you're on.
All good. Okay. Hi, Gerry. Thanks for the talk.
George?
I'm a master's student myself. And as one of the guys in mission control, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the future of mission control and how its mission is changing with the autonomy. I mean, Dragon on Saturday, it's going to go and dock itself. It's a step process, and mission control, I guess, that mission must reflect the change with the technology. So, what's the future of mission control, in your opinion?
I think, you're hitting a good note. It's going to change. It won't go away. But there's a lot of reasons it's got to change. One is the technology in the cockpit is better. The Dragon, if you notice it, do all touchscreen. It was all touchscreen controls, and where's the switch, that you actually have to trip, or a circuit breaker you got to push in. But that technology is really good, and I haven't figured out what they were going to do. If they have a big glitch in the system where they probably got it triply redundant or something, but there's going to be a lot more capability on board. But they're still going to need help particularly when it comes to the off normal situation. As long as things are plodding along, it's going to be okay. And they could probably almost do it with just somebody talking to them every once in a while. But when things start to go bad is when you need the ground. And we proved that more than once in Apollo. Shuttle did the same thing. Shuttle pulled some irons out of the fire. I wasn't around for those, but I really think that and then you throw in Mars, and that's going to be entirely different, because at Mars it takes 16 to 18 minutes, depending on where the planet is, to get a voice transmission in one direction. So you ask a question, and it takes 16 minutes to get there, and they answer, and it takes 16 minutes to get back. But you're not going to be able to help them with anything like Apollo 13, with the tank blowing up. They're going to have, and we've already talked, I've talked to some of the people at JSC. They're talking more about, first of all, you got to have more diagnostic capability on board that's running all the time, and you run diagnostics constantly to make sure the power system there, blah, blah, blah. And you got to have more tools, both physical and software tools, to help if you get into a bad situation at Mars, 16 minutes away one way. So it's going to be an entirely different operation. I think the ground and the Mars mission is going to be mostly planning stuff and get it and streaming it out to them. Today we want you to go to point X at the bottom of the hill and so and take a sample of something, and it'll be a planning tool or a flight planning layout, and then you're going to have to come home eventually, and your device is not now. Okay, it just told me I had to sign in to something, and I knocked it off. Mission control is going to change a lot, and it's not going to take as many people probably. Even the ground systems are much better. Everything now is just. Let me tell you what we had in the control center in Apollo. We had 5 IBM 360 Block 75, 360 Block 75. Those were the best computers IBM had. And one of those computers would fill up most of this, and it was big stuff, and it required a lot of air conditioning, and you walked into those rooms and it was like walking into a refrigerator. And we had 5 of them, and not one of them has as much as my cell phone had in capacity. So that's how far we've come, and the ground systems now are all dispersed. We had everything that we did came through we had an IBM 360 online. We had a running standby that was parallel, and the other 2 were used for other purposes, unless we had to have them on the mission. So we had one computer that we had to tell people so they could, if we wanted to change something on our display, we had to give it to somebody, and they had to punch cards, and put it in the computer. Nowadays, it's all dispersed. The flight controller in that space station picture you saw, they can actually change their own displays in real time. I don't want to look at that voltage anymore. I want to go look at something else. And so they just take it off, and they could switch back and forth and do all kinds of things. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but mission control is going to be a lot different, and particularly a lot different in deep space.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. I mean, I think the delay is the most interesting part, as you picked up on. So thank you.
Yeah, and even at halfway there, when you're halfway there, it's still going to be 8 minutes or something, 8 or 10. So, okay.
Right. So the next one comes from Saurabh Chowdhury, and he asks, Sir, if we ever met or discovered life outside of Earth, how do you think NASA/humanity would react to this?
I think it would make the budget a lot easier. First thing. In fact, I've been hoping that one day, I don't know if any of you are familiar with SETI. SETI is Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI. And it's done with a huge bank of antennas that are in New Mexico. Arecibo has one, big one. There's others around the world, but most of it's in New Mexico. And it's kind of like the movie Contact. Starts with that premise. That's where Jodie Foster is. And they're listening for any intelligence signal. And I've been hoping for years, it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime now, but it's that they would get a hit where somebody would make contact with us. And then I think you'd see the space budget really go up for deep space exploration, because maybe there's somebody out there that could help us and we could help them, or vice versa. And so I really think that Jodie Foster in the movie makes, and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but she makes the point about extraterrestrial intelligence, that she states how many known stars are in our universe, how many in our galaxy, and it's just one of them. I mean, it's billions and billions. There's got to be somebody other than just us out there somewhere in some form. They may not look, that has some sort of brain power. And it's just got, the numbers are just staggering. So I think it's going to happen, and I hope it does. I hope it does. I'd like to be alive when that happens and see how people say, "Oh, all this looking you've done all these years, you finally found something."
Thank you.
We also had a question about whether, I mean, many people ask the same thing, if you need to be a US citizen to be able to join NASA.
The answer is yes. Now, but there's different ways to join NASA. NASA is more than just NASA. The agency, like for instance, that the number of NASA jobs at the Johnson Space Center when I was there was 3,300. And we had, when I was there, we had Grumman all around us. So, and all of them, we worked side by side with them. So not everybody has to be a NASA employee to work on NASA programs, if that makes sense. Same thing with ESA. You know, ESA, you've got the agency, and that's one thing. By the way, your major control centers are up at Noordwijk in Holland. Been there, very, very nice facility. But your companies, you know, the French companies, the German companies, UK companies are all quite capable. And that's why I think had we gotten to the international model earlier, particularly for deep space, it makes a little more sense maybe to go it alone. But the International Space Station has worked well with a lot of international partners. And but I think there's going to be opportunities to be in space and space technology from a lot of angles. See, we haven't even seen yet a European purely commercial company like a SpaceX, but there's going to be one, and there's going to be two, and there'll be three, and there'll be four. There are going to be commercial space companies in the European Union. Does that still exist? I can't remember, but I'm just kidding. Brexit being what it is, and so anyway, I don't get too hung up on NASA being NASA only. Now they do have exchange programs occasionally where they will have an employee of visa and an employee of NASA swap, kind of like a military Italian fighter. An Italian guy comes over here and flies an American fighter for a couple of years, and so there are those kinds of things. But don't get too hung up on just NASA, because NASA, it's not going to be just NASA that does it, and it's not going to be just NASA, not just the US of A that does it. That's my answer.
Yeah, I actually wanted to point out to the people that are dreaming about NASA, but you also mentioned ESA, the European Space Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, in my experience, a lot of the contests for students, for example, that NASA had, ESA also had the equivalent. So I always looked up on both websites, and I used to participate, in the contest that NASA had and in their equivalent in the European Union. And they're particularly, they're the same. So yeah.
Yeah, and ESA, European Space Agency, has had a number of astronauts fly. They just haven't flown on an ESA launch vehicle. They've flown on shuttle. They're going to fly on the SpaceX and Blue Origin eventually. And so I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities that if we're going to have to, I think we're going to have to lead the way in the U.S. So the eyes are going to be on Biden administration to see what they do, and hopefully they'll keep going.
Yep. Thank you very much for the answer. Now let's go next to someone who raised a hand. And my apologies if I pronounce the name wrong. Is Eastway Geoffrey or Jeffrey? If you could, Nikita, unmute him.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, my name's Geoffrey Eastaway. I'm phoning via, I suppose, the Royal Irish Academy and Cork Astronomy Club. And thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I was fascinated with your comments about leadership. I'm very interested in technical leadership. I have been for years, and I wonder if you agree with me that technical leadership is not just the CEO, is not just the director, but it's all the way through the organization. It's such an essential skill, from your graduate engineers down through your supervisors and craftsmen and the people who do. For what I believe is largely a young audience, and also for my fascination, are there traits of leadership that you look for in your graduate engineers, rather than the sort of slightly nebulous ones that you've spoken about the wanting to please some, a person who has some intangible, trait? Are there traits of, I don't know, technical excellence or humility or that sort of thing that you would particularly look for as a senior leader in a technical field?
Well, the first question, I couldn't agree with you more that leadership qualities have got to be shown throughout the organization. It got to start at the top. And as I used a word earlier that I think is leaders have to trust. I think they've got to be trusted from above, and they got to trust the people below them. And so many times, I think what I'm seeing now, and I see it in NASA, I see it, is that tendency is to suck decisions up higher as if they can be made better by somebody that lives inside the Washington Beltway. There's a lot of decisions at NASA being made, not say a lot. There are too many decisions today being made at NASA headquarters, as opposed to the field centers. The strength of NASA is not embedded in Washington, D.C. It's in Houston, it's in Huntsville, Alabama, it's at the Cape, it's at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California, it's at the Langley Research Center in Virginia, on and on and on. That's the strength of NASA. So I think any organization has got to get all of that strength out. You've got to let them into the show, and not a top down. And I think I know what you're getting at. In a technical setting, if you get a top down leadership that starts at the CEO and just pushes everything, this is the way we're going to do it, you're going to wind up with a failure on your hands, because you're only good as that one guy or one gal. And you've got to figure out how to get all of the people involved as a part of it. And I think a leader understands that first. He understands that I'm not going to do this. I'm not in here to make a power play. I'm in here to get a job done. And I'm going to need everybody in this organization, not just me and a couple of other cronies that are going to figure everything out and tell people what to do. So I think, and in leadership, I think that I look for is that people that are willing to listen and particularly develop other people, and not be afraid to give credit. I love to give credit and say, Lucia is amazing at setting up Zoom meetings or something. That makes me, and by the way, I believe that, but I think it makes I think it makes a lot of difference to people to be appreciated. Now, I'm not saying carry somebody along if they aren't, or if they aren't cutting it, but if they're getting the job done, develop them, bring them along as you grow, and as you learn things, share it with them, and then go to a pub and have a good, cool one with them, and you can kind of seal it off. I see that Saturn V over your right shoulder, and
You're never too old to get a good bit of Lego, and that was my son. That was my son's Christmas present.
Okay. Well, I've got
To me, to me.
but it's setting up too high. I didn't want to get it down.
I utterly agree with what you said about listening, growing people on, and have sadly in my technical career seen too little of it. It's a message that I hope your younger listeners will really take to heart. Thank you so much. And if you ever find yourself in Cork, give us a shout and let's have some Guinness.
My family came from County Cork.
No, really?
Yes, right.
Thank you. Okay, right.
So, well,
the
good.
next-
Thank you.
Right, so the next one comes from Emilia Ramirez, and she asks, "Hello, I would like to ask something. Life is overwhelming the way it is right now. What does it take to do what you did? How did you cope with the stress or anxiety, if you ever had any, and what kept you going?"
Boy, that's a big one. I did have a lot of stress. I'm thinking back, even in the Air Force, it was in a pretty risky business. But there was, I think part of it was preparation that I had in college at Texas A&M. I was in the Corps of Cadets. I was in military, even in high school, they had junior ROTC, and I took it there. So discipline was kind of a strong thing with me. It still is. And I like preciseness and all that. But I think there was something that in the space business, it really brought it out that, we can do this. It's not going to be easy. And we had that leadership that we were talking about just a while ago, that turned us loose and let us do it. And I can remember going home at night during the middle of a mission and getting a good night's sleep. Now, Apollo 13 wasn't that way, but on Apollo 13, I got off shift. My gold team finished, and Gene Kranz's white team came in to relieve us. And I went out to play a softball game. Had on my sweatsuit and all that, and they came out and got us. And I went back into the control center. The first time I went in, I still had on my softball clothes, and I could tell right away that I better go home because I had to come back and relieve Glenn. When I left him with a perfectly good spacecraft, and he blew up the oxygen tank while I was out playing a softball. But when you live in a high-risk environment long enough, I think it either drives you away from it because you just don't like it, or it kind of sucks you in. People ask me, "What's the best job you ever had in your life?" And I said, when I was a flight director in mission control. And I mean that. And I've held some big jobs after that they were good, they were fun, but nothing like the exhilaration of beating it down and doing a tough job and getting it finished. And it was risky, and we lost some people. We lost 3 crewmen in the fire. I lost good friends in the Air Force. So I had a little bit, and if you're going to be in that business, you have to have a little bit of scar tissue. I mean, it's not like the world comes to an end. It's a risky business. People have asked me what's NASA's primary purpose, and I said it is to manage risk. You manage it as low as you can, but you're never going to manage it to zero. Same thing can be said of getting out of the M4. You certainly want to manage the risk to zero, but you can't. You just can't. It's always going to be a risk when you get out there on the A4, maybe. That's it. The stress has never bothered me, and I think it was just because I was kind of pulled into the high risk stuff.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a couple of more. So I see Rai has his hand up. Let me just. Okay. Second. Okay, nope. Then let's go with Raj.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like most of these satellites are orbiting in the lower Earth orbit, right?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure I understood the question.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, why are these satellites orbiting the lower Earth orbit instead of the higher Earth orbit, where the orbital velocity requirements are low?
If I understand your question, why do we stay so low and not get up higher? And it's all a matter of energy, if that's the question that you've asked. To get a mass to a higher level, particularly like one like the shuttle was carrying up to the space station, they built that at around 200 miles, something like that, and then boosted it up to 250 for operation. And but there's just not enough propulsion. You could build a smaller station probably and go higher, for instance, or you could put it in an orbit that maybe is not so circular, maybe more what we call highly parabolic, with a low perigee and a very high apogee, low altitude and high altitude. But you still, every time you come through that low altitude, you get drag, and so it starts lowering the higher. And I probably didn't make much sense with that, but the operation at different altitudes above the Earth, particularly, are very highly dependent on how much energy you have to put them up there, and maintain them there too. The one thing about space station, which is kind of unique, is that a lot of their studies are Earth oriented, so they don't want to get too far away, or it makes that not quite so good. And so I hope I answered your question, but I may not have.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question that is more personal. I've seen a lot of questions like this. One of them would be, how much does the university you study at undergraduate level matter when it comes to pursuing a career in aerospace?
An undergraduate level degree from my university is absolute, and others like us, University of Texas and Stanford and any of them, are absolutely essential. Now, having said that, it depends on what level you want to go to. Now, I know most of you or all of you, except maybe some that have already finished, are in college, or maybe if there's a high school student around you, you intend to go to college. And I would highly advise you to do that. But one of the shortages that we have in this country, and I think you've got it too, is that we are losing our tradesmen, tradecraft people that can build things. And so I don't put anybody, if somebody wants to be a precision welder or a precision build up electronic components, or somebody that does wiring for complex machines like a spacecraft, we've got to have those kind of people too. And I really, in Texas, I can tell you, in the state of Texas here, I was on the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And for years, of course, the promotion was higher education, university, graduate level, undergrad or graduate level, undergraduate and graduate. And toward the end of my term as governor, appointed by the governor of Texas, and I served a 6-year term. Toward the end of the term, we started using a new term up through the end of high school. And so rather than talking about only higher ed, which we universities, we started emphasizing post-secondary education. Post-secondary includes certification as physician assistants, whatever, but things like welders and all that with it, because that part of our workforce is slowly going away, and we've got a large uneducated workforce that some didn't even finish high school, that we need to bring along. And if they're not interested in university, look, we can find you can find a field of your choice that you might work. So I would encourage everyone to go to college. There's more to college, and you folks are experiencing it right now. There's more to college than just learning what's in the books. It's relationship, except when you have a pandemic. It's relationships with other people. It's working as a group, working as a team on certain things, and which the pandemic has really made it difficult. But college, I think, has a lot more to it than just books and learning. It's maturing, and it's a confidence builder that is so important. And particularly if you're going to go into, I know a lot of you, I know Lucia at least is a computer science major, but I bet a lot of you are technically oriented, software, something like computer science or something. And those are so important. You've got to finish and then opportunity for the future.
Thank you very much for this very nice answer. And there are a lot of people that ask you why you did not go into space. You tried to cover a little bit during the presentation.
Yeah.
But in particular, you want to know why.
I was a little bit out of sync with when the original 7 astronauts were all test pilots. And just like in the UK, you have test pilot schools that they actually went to. We have a Navy test pilot school, we have an Air Force test pilot school. All of them were graduates of that school. The second group was the same way. That's about the time I came in. There was no way I was going to compete with those people. Now, toward the next group, the third group, if I had decided, I might have had a chance, although I doubt it, because they were looking for scientists. And the scientist, they actually met, is a lunar, is geologist. And, but they weren't looking for other pilots. They had plenty of pilots and plenty of mission specialists, which were kind of like flight engineers, and but they wanted some scientists. So I really think I went for it because I knew I knew I could do it, and because of my background in engineering and flight, and but I would go. People back when the shuttle, right before the Challenger accident, this was about a year before it, and that's when Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, was selected to go on the flight of Challenger that exploded. And but they were going to fly a teacher, they were going to fly an entertainer, they were going to fly a journalist. And I worked with John Denver, who was a good friend, singer, and he was also a pilot. And he was really kind of trying to be the entertainer. And I helped him write his letter to, well, I wrote a letter to the administrator, the head of NASA, and said, I ought to go because I was the center director at Johnson Space Center then. And I said, I ought to go because I manage all of these astronauts and all that. And I need to know what this is really like. I need to experience. So you ought to have a category called NASA management that over time you would fly one or two or three. And with my flight background and all that, I would be perfect. Well, shortly after that, then the Challenger accident happened. And so that program was put aside. But I have told people, and I mean it as sure as I'm sitting here right now. If somebody asked me if I would go, right now, I'd say, yes, send me, I'll go. I'd love to. The risk be damned.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I think we will go with two more questions and wrap it up because it's a little bit late. So from the people who have raised hands,
I'm about to get talked out, yeah.
I do understand. Let's go with Atharva Anand. Nikita, if you could please unmute.
Hello, sir. My question is that are there any upcoming space missions that mainly will focus on reducing the space debris, as these pose great threats to the satellites and the telescopes in orbit?
Yeah, big problem. And what he is alluding to is the extreme amount of junk that we produced in space, particularly in low Earth orbit, where there are still spent launch vehicles, dead satellites, but then an awful lot of little pieces of debris that were caused by, in the old days, we used to use a lot of explosive bolts to separate modules of a spacecraft or something like that. And those would spew out pieces of debris. And in fact, we took a hit on one of the shuttle landings, or it happened in flight, but when they landed, the windscreen on the front of the shuttle that they looked out was about 2 inches thick because it got hot up there. And there was a penetration that went in about 1/2 inch. And they later turned out, when they got it on the ground, analyzed it, it was a chip paint, but the velocity was so fast that it had actually penetrated the glass, about 1/2 inch out of 2 inches. So you can imagine what a big chunk might do if it hit it. There's a lot of studies going on right now trying to figure out how to clean that mess up. And there's some pretty good technology that's starting to show up. Some of it even involves going out with something and throwing a net over this thing and bringing it. These are robotic spacecraft that do that. Throw a net over this spent satellite and then deorbit it. And it burn up. It'll burn. It doesn't have a heat shield. Doesn't have a heat shield, so it can't make it through the atmosphere. But then there's all these little bitty pieces, and that's going to be a real problem. And they've tried to figure out, well, would magnetics work? Probably not. It's too much, stainless steel and metals that would not attract to a magnet. but it's a mess, and it's particularly a mess at 21,000 miles, 21.5. That's where the geosynchronous satellites are, the communication satellites. That their rotational rate around the Earth at the equator is the same rate that the Earth is rotating. So it appears that it's fixed, and that's how you get a relay satellite up and down. And those at that 21,500, there's been so many satellites put up there. Some are derelict now, and they've also had, you know, maneuvers and things like that that have not worked right, where they lost parts off of them. And so 21,500 is kind of like a junkyard. And then there's more. Then there's some more at low Earth orbit, more around the 100-mile. But it doesn't stay there very long because the atmosphere will finally suck it, slow it down enough that it falls down. But you're hitting on if you read the journals of spaceflight of all kinds, I mean, there's a gazillion of them. That's in every one of them. Almost every month there's another worry. And the space station has had some near misses, and they've had to move the space station a couple of times because they could see coming up that there was going to be a 4-foot section off of something or other that was going to collide with it. So they would make a slight maneuver early with the station and to make it miss. And then finally there's at NORAD, it's called North American Air Defense or something. It's the radars. They can track everything in space, every particle in space, down to about something the size of probably a cricket ball or something that size. They can track all of that debris, and it's just everywhere. So it's going to have to be a problem that's dealt with. Good question.
All right. As one more, just to kind of wrap up, it comes from Padraig O'Meara, and they ask, what life advice do you give to your own children after everything that you've done and experienced? It's for my nephew, Sam. He is obsessed with space exploration.
Good. Okay, that's a good one to end on because, you know, we've got 2 kids. We moved all over the U.S., and it's kind of like a military family. You know, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. In our kids' case, they got to meet presidents and heads of state, and both of them have just turned out to be wonderful people and both successful business people. And in fact, our daughter owns her own public relations firm. Guess what? Most of our clients are aerospace clients and marketing and public relations. And she's in Houston. We're about 300 miles away. I think, you know, the best example, I think the best thing to do with your kids is to give them a good example to watch and see. And I think both our kids, I know, watched both of us carefully, I guess, because my wife Sandy and I, we were doing this at the same time. And I didn't get to see many, you know, Little League ball games or Boy Scout meetings and all, because she was having to do that. We were working weekends and everything else. But when we got together, it was a fun time. We went camping in mountains of Montana and all kinds of things. When it came to education, I think they kind of picked it up on their own. There was never any question that they were going to go to college. It wasn't even much of a question of what they were going to study. So it didn't take much advice there, let me say it that way. But I think the thing that I probably came to, what built my career was my willingness to make change and go somewhere else and try something different. And there was a clock, must have been an unconscious clock in my head. About every 4 years, it seemed like I had I figured this an attitude of kind of figured this out. What am I going to do now? And at each point, there was a break that fortuitously happened. I was 4 years in the control center as a Gemini flight controller and got that done. And lo and behold, I was getting ready to do my 5th year as in the same position for Apollo, and the fire happened. And during the break, 21 months of break between there, Kraft decided he wanted another flight director. So I had a new job, new set of things to do. And I did that for 4 more years from 68 to 72. And then I get a call that says, we want to talk to you about coming to Washington to work with the Congress. And I thought, what? I was 38 years old. And I was a Texas A&M aeronautical engineer. I didn't know anything about Washington and how the Congress clicked and what made it click. But the more I thought about it, I went up and talked to the head of the agency, and they said, we need somebody that can explain the technical stuff to members of Congress about the shuttle to keep it on, to keep it going. And so I said, okay. And I came back and talked to Sandy. You want to go to Washington? Yeah, let's go to Washington. Off we went to Washington. And I did that for about 4 years. It drove me nuts, being inside that bubble of crazy stuff with congressmen. But I wanted to get out of there because I could sense it was pulling on me. Boy, this is really a neat place. You go to a White House dinner, or you go to a reception on the Hill with all the congressmen. Ah, man, this is really it. Yeah. They're not making anything happen. I wanted to get back to the real world. So anyway, then I went and did some other thing, came back to finish up at JSC. My point is this. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice is that don't be afraid to make a change. And obviously, the biggest change I made was going to Washington. The other changes were easier because it was more management by that time, but it was management of technical stuff that I knew. Washington was a complete change. And let me tell you what happened. Going to Washington broke me out of the pack. I was one of the few guys that ever left Johnson Space Center. It broke me out of the pack. I got new exposure. I got exposure to other centers of NASA in a lot different light. And when I came back to the Johnson Space Center, it made me a better center director because I understood the other centers and their capabilities a lot better. And I understood what went on in Washington. So, bottom line, don't be afraid to make a change. Don't get wrapped up in the geography of where you are or where you want to be. I wanted to be in Texas, and I finally got it. But you can always make that happen. But follow the trail where the path leads you, and don't be afraid to make the change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And on that note, it's probably best to wrap up. We could go for 3 hours straight.
Yeah. It's almost beer time here, and it's past your beer time. So
yeah, definitely. So yes, Mr. Griffin, thank you so much for joining us, and for giving this speech. I can see everyone's writing, just the best stuff. Thank you.
See that. I see those too, and I appreciate every one of them. And I say again, my pleasure, and thanks to Lucia for stepping up and sending me the email to say, come on. And
it was my pleasure. You're a really inspiration for me. And ever since I listened to you in the conference, I really want to ask you some questions. I really want to find out more about you and how you work with NASA. And I never had the courage somehow to actually approach it. But I'm very, very, very glad that I did it. So
okay.
I should be the one. Thank you.
Remember mission control.
Yep.
There it is.
Hopefully we'll be able to do some really nice things ourselves as you did.
Well, if I get to when I get to the UK, have to look you up. And I told Lucia in a private conversation earlier that London is, well, the whole UK, but London is my special love. And I've been there a lot. I know it well. I finally, last year, by the way, no, year before last, I finally made Wales and had a very nice time out there. I've been to Ireland and Scotland and UK, England a lot, and it's a wonderful place. I look forward to seeing you in a pub in London.
Well, I hope that once this whole global situation with the pandemic is over, maybe you might be able to actually come to Kings and have an event.
There you go. There you go. I'd be glad to.
That would be absolutely lovely.
I'll be glad to. We'll work it out.
Of course.
Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. And my voice is starting to get a little needing some liquid other than iced tea. So, okay.
All right. Thank you very much. And,
ciao. See you later.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you very much once
guys.
again.
Thank you, guys. Okay.
Have an
Bye.
excellent day. Goodbye.
And just before everyone quickly hops off, I'd like to say a big thank you to the collaborating societies, in particular, Imperial Robotics Society, the KCL Tech Society, of course, UCL Space Society, UCL Tech Society, one second, as well as KCL Engineering Society, Women in STEM Society, the KCL one, Oxram, KCL Machine Learning, KCL Blockchain Society, and of course the Manchester Robotics Society. And again, guys, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so please stay posted. We'll ask the collaborating societies to possibly also post that link out. And yeah, that should be done within a week or so. So thank you all very much for coming along. And please get yourself a membership. It actually helps us quite a lot. We can then bargain with KCLSU and the rest of the bureaucrats at KCL that actually try to sort of make this stream not happen. So yeah, please do that. And yeah, thanks to the KCL Robotics Committee, especially Lucia. She's helped out a lot. She's, reached out to him. He said yes, and great help. Also to Christopher, to Joey, Sartak, Pratibha, Pratyaksha, and yes,
Natalia, also.
Natalia, of course, and Moni. Right, there we go. The entire KCL Robotics Committee. Yeah, they've all been a massive help. So thank you all for coming and have a great evening.
And possibly see you all at another event. Maybe we will do something else in the future.
Yes, and if you want to polish up on your engineering skills, we will be having an event next week on Saturday on how to use an Arduino. Yeah, that is also upcoming. And then the week following that, there possibly will be a Python tutorial, just a beginner's Python tutorial. So yeah, please stay posted. All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.